welcome. We have a fantastic debate planned for today, and we have two wonderful debaters. So on the one hand, we have Rob Koons. He is a professor at UT Austin. And then we also have Alex Malpass, a formidable scholar in his own right, currently an independent scholar. And we will be debating the question of whether the universe began to exist. Rob will go first with a 15-minute opening statement, and then we will go to Alex. So Rob, would you like to start?
Great. So thanks, Nathan, for organizing this. I think it's a really timely, important topic. So if the universe has a cause, its cause will be a first cause, uncaused being. And arguments for such a first cause have a long history and wide multicultural appeal, stretching back to some of the pre-Socratic philosophers of ancient Greece, including many of history's universal geniuses like Plato, Aristotle, Avicenna, Maimonides, Aquinas, Newton, Leibniz, and others. It spans at least 5 civilizations and religious traditions: Greco-Roman paganism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the Nyaya school in India, modern deism, to mention at least a few. So I want to start with a few clarifying questions. Let me see if I can get this to work properly. Okay, good. Can you see what is the universe showing up? Yes, great. So what is the universe? It's the totality of causable things, on my view. And what do I mean by causeable? I mean a being of such a kind that it's conceivable that things of such a kind have a cause. So an uncausable being would have to have a nature of such a kind that it's inconceivable that such a nature would have a cause. Now, what do I mean by cause? Oops, sorry. I mean something like this. If X is the cause of Y, then X has the power to make it the case that Y existed, and X actually exercised that power. So a cause in this sense is a productive cause, something responsible for the existence of something else. I'm going to assume that causation is irreflexive, that nothing can cause itself to exist. In fact, cause and effect must be separate existences, as David Hume put it. So an effect can't even so much as overlap with its cause. If a group of things has a joint cause, then the joint cause is going to be separate from each of the parts of the effect as well. I'm also going to assume that causation is transitive. If X causes Y and Y causes Z, then X causes Z. And consequently, causation will be asymmetric, and there'll be no causal circles when you put those two facts together. One thing I'm not assuming is that the first cause exists before its effect, in the literal temporal sense of before, or that it exists simultaneously with its effect. There's nothing in the definition of a productive cause that requires that the cause or the effect exist temporally at all. There's nothing inconceivable about an internal, eternal, or timeless being causing eternally the existence of another eternal being. In fact, there's nothing inconceivable about an eternal thing causing the existence of things within time. It's causation, I would argue, that gives a direction to the arrow of time, and therefore we can assume that causation figures in the definition of time. And since definitions cannot be circular, this means that time cannot figure in the definition of causation. I'm also going to deploy a principle of universal causation. So I'm going to argue that I assume that every causable thing has a cause, and every group of causable things has a joint cause. Now, I'm not assuming, this is my last point here, that causes necessitate or determine their effects. A world of universal causation is one thing, a world of universal determinism is another. Causes are necessary conditions of their effects, they're not sufficient conditions. No cause, no effect, in the circumstances at least, but the mere existence of the cause is no guarantee that any effect will follow, as Elizabeth Anscombe argued in Determinism and Determination and Causality, her inaugural lecture at Cambridge. Now, these principles of universal causation are axioms of reason, I view. The main argument for universal causation, therefore, is going to be dialectical and ultimately, from my point of view, epistemological. That is, an argument from the possibility of empirical knowledge. If causable things could exist without a cause, then we would have to take seriously the possibility that all our sensory inputs and our empirical data could have simply popped into existence without any causal precursor whatsoever. Any restrictions on the principles of universal causation would have to be self-evident. There's only one such self-evident restriction, that is the restriction to the domain of the causeable, that is, to the things making up the universe. So I'm going to sketch very briefly 3 arguments for first cause, one drawn from Aristotle and Aquinas' first way, one from the Kalam tradition of medieval Islam, and a third from the work of Avicenna, Aquinas' second way, and Leibniz. So let's begin with Aristotle's prime mover argument, Physics 7 and 8. Time, for Aristotle, does not exist independent of change. Time is simply the measure of change. Hence, the forward motion of time depends on the continuous and perpetual extension of change. But every change must have a cause, and events in the past or the future cannot cause changes in the present. Causes within time are limited to effects within the same period of time. The totality of changes occurring at the present moment must have a cause, and this cause cannot exist in the present, since that would involve circularity, and they also cannot exist in the past or the future. So therefore, there must be at each moment of time an eternal or timeless cause of the most fundamental changes occurring at that moment. Nothing within time, in other words, can adequately explain why time itself has to roll forward. Only something timeless, utterly beyond time, could provide the causal explanation for the continuity of change and consequently for the continuous passage of time. For example, inertia cannot explain this, since inertia is a time-dependent phenomenon. It states that if a body has been moving at a certain velocity throughout a span of time and no force acts on it, then if a new moment of time t arrives, the body will continue to move at that velocity at that new moment t. But inertia alone cannot explain why t should arrive at all, why, in other words, time shouldn't grind to a halt before reaching t. Let's take a specific example, a bowling ball rolling towards a plane representing the end of the lane. Let's say that the bowling ball is moving at midnight at 10 meters per second from the plane, moving toward the plane at 1 meter per second on a frictionless surface with no forces acting on it. We can predict that if the moment 12:10 a.m. arrives, the ball will at that moment be in contact with the plane. But what explains the extension of time to 12:10? We can conceive of a world in which the ball moves throughout the open interval of midnight to 12:10, but the endpoint 12:10 never itself arrives, is never actual. The inertial movement of the ball cannot explain this fact, since inertia is time dependent. It says if a moment 12:10 arrives, then it will be moving at that velocity with no forces acting on it. But for 12:10 to arrive, there must be some primordial or fundamental change c occurring at 12:10. A change not caused by any other change at 12:10. Since a cause acting at that time, that change C must have a cause B, but the cause B cannot act at 12:10 a.m., since a cause acting at that time would have to change from not acting to acting then. And so one change at 12:10 would just be causing another change at that time. That's inconsistent with C's being a primordial change at 12:10. Thus, the cause B, and the cause B cannot act at any earlier time or later time either, because causation cannot operate over a temporal gap. So by process of elimination, the cause B ultimately responsible for the arrival of 12:10 a.m. must be a timeless or eternal cause. Could the cause of primordial change C be a process that takes place over some open interval that immediately abuts the time t, 12:10? No, because then we can still ask, when does this process cause the change C? It cannot cause the change at any time prior to 12:10, so it must cause it at 12:10. This means the process itself must change from being a potential cause of C to being an actual cause of C. And once again, we've failed to explain the arrival of 12:10 itself. We've merely identified one more change occurring at 12:10. So the prime mover argument supplies us with a first cause of all motion and change in the universe, a first cause that is beyond time. The first cause does not act at a time. It is the cause of the passage of time itself, a cause from outside of time. The first cause is neither, therefore, an originating cause nor a sustaining cause, since originating and sustaining causes must act within time. Now let's turn to the question of the existence of the universe. Like change, the existence of causable things must have a cause. But this first cause of the universe will not act within time, since time itself is an aspect of the universe. But must there be a first cause? Now mathematics, that is set theory with axiom of choice, tells us that if everything causable has a cause, and if there are no causal circles or infinite regresses, then there must be an uncausable first cause. But why couldn't there be an infinite regress, each part of which is causable and so part of the universe? So I have two responses to the infinite regress problem, which are my second and third arguments. One asserts that such regresses are impossible, the Kalam strategy, and the other asserts that such regresses are, even if possible, irrelevant, and that's the aggregation strategy. So my version of the Kalam strategy builds on the Grim Reaper thought experiment of the American philosopher Jose Benedetti. In this thought experiment, a victim, Fred, faces an infinite number of Grim Reapers, numbered from 1 to infinity. Each Grim Reaper has an assigned time of action. Grim Reaper 1 at 12:01 a.m., Grim Reaper 2 at 30 seconds after midnight, Grim Reaper 3 at 15 seconds after midnight, and so on. So there is, temporally speaking, no first Grim Reaper. All the Grim Reapers are scheduled to act at some time within the first minute following midnight. For any finite period after midnight, an infinite number of Grim Reapers' assigned times will have passed. When a Grim Reaper's assigned time arrives, it performs a simple task. If Fred has already been killed by an earlier Grim Reaper, it does nothing. Otherwise, it kills Fred. Now, this scenario is obviously impossible. It's clear that some Grim Reaper will kill Fred, since if no one else does, Grim Reaper 1 will kill him at 12:01. So there's some Grim Reaper n that kills Fred at midnight plus 1/2 to the n minutes. But this means that Grim Reapers n plus 1, n plus 2, and so on did nothing, despite the fact that Fred was still alive when their assigned times arrived, and that's a contradiction. Now, to turn this argument into an argument for a first cause, I'll make a couple of changes. Instead of Grim Reapers, I'll have Grim Recorders, whose job is simply to record a certain numeral on a pad of paper. Each Grim Reaper is assigned a year: Grim Reaper 1, 1 BC, 2, 2 BC, 3, 3 BC, and so on, through an infinite past. Each Grim Reaper flips a coin at the beginning of its assigned year. If the coin flip lands heads, then Grim Reaper n will write his numeral n on the pad, erasing any earlier numbers that are there. If the coin lands tails, and if no earlier Grim Reaper has written his number on the pad, then Grim Reaper n will write the numeral on n on the pad. If the coin lands tails, and some earlier Grim Recorder has written his number, then Recorder n does nothing and passes the sheet on unchanged to his successor in the next year. Now, if the coin lands heads an infinite number of times, then the Recorder scenario is clearly possible, assuming, that is, that causal regresses are possible in the first place. Each Recorder seeing heads writes his number on the pad, and each Recorder seeing tails. For each Recorder seeing tails, there will be an earlier Recorder who saw heads and wrote its number on the pad, and that number will just get passed on to the successor. Let's call this the lucky Recorder scenario, the one in which heads shows up an infinite number of times. However, if all the coins lands tails, just to keep it simple, then we have a scenario that's exactly like Benedetti's original thought experiment. We've seen that that scenario is logically impossible. Let's call that the unlucky scenario, unlucky Recorder scenario. So here's the simple argument. If infinite causal regresses are possible, then the lucky Recorder scenario is possible. There's no contradiction or impossibility involved there. If a scenario is possible, and if in that scenario there's a class of causally independent chance events, then any mathematically possible combination of those chance events is also possible. This is a kind of causal or modal symmetry principle. And I'm assuming that all the coin tosses were causally independent of each other. Let's build that into the thought experiment. So number 3, by 1 in the causal symmetry principle, if infinite regresses are possible, then the unlucky Recorder scenario is also possible. But the unlucky Recorder scenario is impossible because it involves a logical contradiction. So by reductio, infinite causal regresses are impossible. So that's the second argument. This argument makes my second response to the infinite regress argument, my third and final argument, is the aggregation strategy. This was invented, I think, by the Persian philosopher Ibn Sina, and also deployed by Aquinas, Duns Scotus, Leibniz, Samuel Clarke, and others. So here's this argument. Let's assume that every plurality of causable things has a cause. Now, the universe is a plurality of causable things by definition. It is just the totality of all causable things. So the universe has a cause G. The cause of the universe cannot belong to the universe because of the separateness of causes and effects. So G does not belong to the universe, but the universe contains all causable things. So G, the cause of the universe, is uncaused and therefore uncausable. And it's the uncausable cause of the universe. This argument makes infinite regresses irrelevant, since even if there were an infinite regress, all the members of the regress would be causable, and so would be parts or members of the universe. If the universe as a whole is causable, and every causable plurality has a cause, then all the regresses it contains would also be caused by something uncausable in this case. But is it right to suppose that an infinite regress of causable things is itself causable? Yes, and here's why. Suppose that each galaxy, for instance, has been caused by an earlier galaxy, and that's still by a still earlier galaxy, and so on ad infinitum. Right? So galaxy A1 caused by galaxy A2, A2 by A3, and so on. Is the whole series A1, A2, A3, ... causable? Sure, because we can imagine a second series of galaxies, B2, B3, B4, and so on, with B2 causing A1, B3 causing A2, B4 causing A3, and so on. So the possible existence of the series B2, B3, and so on demonstrates the conceivability of the series A1 through A1, 2, A2, 3, and so on having a cause. Since it's conceivable that the series have a cause, it must have a cause by universal causation. And that cause must be uncausable. But couldn't we restrict universal causation? Why can't we suppose that any causable finite series of things has a cause, without including infinite regresses within the principle? So I have two responses to this. First, any restriction of the principle needs a justification, and we haven't yet been given one. This is simply an ad hoc defensive move based on some reluctance to accept the conclusion. Second, such a restriction of universal causation would still have the consequence of destroying the possibility of empirical knowledge. How could I know a priori, that is prior to and independent of any empirical knowledge, that my current mental state does not involve one or more infinite regresses? For example, my sense data occurring right now could be caused by an exactly similar data set 1 nanosecond earlier, and that one by another data set half a nanosecond before that, and so on, with the whole set of data constituting an infinite regress within within two nanoseconds of time. If my current sensory data were caused by such an internal infinite regress, then if we restrict universal causation, my current sensory state might have no cause at all outside my mind. And if they might have no such cause, then I would have no knowledge based on that mental state and its contents, and so no empirical knowledge at all. So I can know that I have some empirical knowledge only by assuming the truth of an unrestricted principle of universal causation. Now, none of my arguments required that the universe began to exist at a certain moment in time in the past. Even my Kalam-like grim recorder argument does not rule out an infinite past, so long as that past does not involve an infinite causal regress. Right? So you could have an infinite past as long as the causal series is finite. The uncausable cause of the universe stands outside the universe, and so beyond the bounds of space and time. Okay, that's the whole shebang. So I guess I came in under time, did I?
Okay, perfect. All right, so Alex, why don't you go ahead with your opening statement?
Okay, cool. So I've been thinking about this for a while, but I'm not as organized as Rob, so I wasn't able to write down a formal opening statement. I'd like to be able to do that and then share it with him in advance, but like I said, I'm disorganized and didn't get around to that. But I did give him a clue because I shared a version of the argument I'm going to be presenting, so hopefully it doesn't feel like I'm ambushing it. I thought I would also effectively waste a couple of minutes of my opening by saying some nice things about Rob, because I think it's important to set the scene. So Rob's, for those who don't know, is one of the leading, I would say one of the leading theistic philosophers of religion that's currently writing today, and is setting the agenda in various areas that he's working in. So it really is an honour from my point of view to be able to spend this time talking with him today about a subject that we're both very interested in, even if we disagree and take different sides of that. So I just wanted to get that out of the way in the first place. I'm looking forward to learning quite a lot more about how Rob looks at things, and I'm sure that his critiques of the things that I say will be fruitful. So yeah, I think this is going to be fun from my point of view. A couple of other words about the dialectic, I guess. Normally in a debate like this, one person puts an argument for you. You've got a proposition on the table, one person sort of tries to advance that proposition, the other person basically nitpicks and sort of claims that the other person hasn't made their case or something. So to be a good sport and to play the game a little bit more fairly, I thought that I would actually positively try and argue for the contrary of the proposition. So the proposition is the universe has a cause. So I'm going to offer an argument to show that it doesn't have a cause, possibly even that it couldn't have had a cause. Right? So I'm taking on a burden of responsibility there that, strictly speaking, I guess I don't need to do that, but it seems reasonable to do. It seems a bit more fun. Doing so complicates the dialectic somewhat because how do we evaluate what's going on? Right? I'm defending an argument at some points and Rob will be critiquing it, but he doesn't need to presuppose the same things that he made in his argument when he's making his critiques. Right? So he could look like he's being inconsistent because critique of my argument might presuppose something that his argument denies. But that doesn't matter because it's simply a dialectical to and fro. So it might be difficult to keep track, but hopefully we can keep the audience in the loop as we go along. Okay, I think that's enough ground setting. So what I'm going to do is just run through two things. I'm going to try and keep it quite simple. I'm going to give an argument that the universe couldn't have had a cause, and then I'm going to present a model which, sorry Rob, I didn't tell you about this bit beforehand, but it won't be any surprise to you when we get there. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But the point of the model, I'll come to the model bit in a moment. Let's start off with the argument. So first of all, let me run through some premises. So the first premise is for each material thing X, there is some time at which X was created, right? And reasons for thinking that this is true, here's two. Right? For one thing, the premise is true if you think that God created all material things. I mean, that seems like the sort of thing Christian theists, most varieties of Christian theists are going to agree to. The second thing is just, well, it seems to be ruling out this kind of straightforward naturalist kind of meme at this point, which is to say, yeah, but maybe the universe just wasn't caused or something, maybe it's the exception to the rule. It's a material object that wasn't created at any point in time. So premise one seems to be ruling out those two things, in which case I think it seems likely to be the sort of thing that Rob would agree to. We can talk more about that, of course, as we go along. For premise two is just saying for each material thing X, if X was created, then X was created out of some pre-existing material. It seems to be the most interesting premise I'm going to put forward today. Let's see some reasons why we might think that that's true. So here's an argument, well, not an argument, here's a kind of intuition pump from Wes Morrison. This comes from his 2002 paper, Creation Ex Nihilo and the Big Bang, where he asks you to consider two scenarios, right? In the first one, we've got an efficient cause, but we don't have a material cause. That is, there's a builder, but there's no materials for him to build anything with. In the second scenario, it's the other way around. We've got material cause, as in we've got some stuff that we could make something out of, but there's no builder there, so there's no efficient cause. Now, in the first scenario, as Wes puts it, there's no lumber, no nails, no bricks, no mortar, no building materials of any kind, but there is a builder. And one day the builder says, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, let there be a house, and there was a house. In the second scenario, there's no builder, but there is lumber, nails, bricks, mortar, and other necessary building materials. One day these materials spontaneously organize themselves into the shape of a house. Now, the thought is just that both of these seem kind of offensive to the intuition, right? It doesn't feel like in either case anything is going to get made, right? Just the mere assemblage of a bunch of nails and wood and stuff isn't going to turn itself into a house on its own, and just the presence of a builder without any materials to make a house out of isn't going to be any more successful, right? It seems like they're on a kind of epistemic par with one another, at least that's how it seems to me. And you can't really talk about this subject without bringing in this lovely quote from Felipe Leon. He says that saying that an omnipotent builder can create a house without pre-existing materials seems to be on an epistemic par with saying that an omnipotent being can throw up a lunch from a completely empty stomach with a sufficiently strenuous dry heave. So this is the intuition pump. So hopefully people can see why that seems intuitive, right? So it just sort of seems true that for each material thing that was created, it was created out of some pre-existing material, and we can't dry heave anything into existence on an empty stomach. Okay. Premise 3 is just follows from those two. Therefore, there's a beginningless chain of material things, each of which is created out of prior material. Does that follow strictly logically? I mean, I probably have to tighten this up a bit to make it like strictly speaking, logically watertight, but you can see what I mean. And then, just in case it's not clear, it seems to me that the creation of a material thing out of pre-existing material is a cause, right? That's something is being caused to exist. If that happens, if I make something out of a bit of Play-Doh, and if I make Mr. Potato Head by putting all the bits together or something, I've caused Mr. Potato Head to come into existence. And that assemblage or resculpting of matter into a new shape or form seems to me a type of cause. And that just means, from 3 and 4, then it just seems like we've got a beginningless chain, not just of material things, but of causes. So it looks a bit like this, right? You've just got this kind of like beginningless sequence. Start with some object like this one. Here's a phone, right? That was made out of some pre-existing stuff. Go and look at that pre-existing stuff. Well, at some point that was made, and when it was made out of some pre-existing stuff. Go and look at that, same story, on and on and on. And if the premises are all true, there couldn't have been a material thing that wasn't made from some other pre-existing material stuff. So it seems to me that if the premises are true, then there's a beginningless causal chain as a consequence of that. So, one other thing I guess I wanted to say in the dialectic stuff at the beginning is it's really quite hard to, unfair in a way, because almost nobody in the history of philosophy advances arguments for this conclusion that it couldn't have been a cause. Whereas, as Rob outlined, there's loads of intellectual tradition that he can draw upon in order to make his case. So I was sniffing around for arguments that make the case. It seems to me the strongest one I can come up with, but I don't have Aquinas and Aristotle and those people to fall back on when making this type of argument. So that's about as much as I can say, I think, for a stab at arguing that the universe couldn't have had a cause. Like I said, I'm trying to take on the dialectical burden just to make it a bit more fun. Hopefully that's intuitive. Yeah, and hopefully I've said enough to motivate the premises. I don't know, how long have I got at this point, mate? Like 6 minutes. Okay, I'm definitely not going to talk for another 6 minutes, but I will try and fill as much as I can. So one more slide. It's simply just, I want the audience to keep in mind a certain model, right? That when Rob's trying to argue that there couldn't be a beginningless past, he might be successful in ruling out some versions of the beginningless past, and that's okay. All I need, I think, when I'm taking off my positive argument-making hat and putting on my nitpicker's hat, all I need is for one counterexample to Rob's arguments in order to successfully nitpick them, it seems to me. So the one I think that we're going to spend time talking about later will be this type of model. So what's going on here is we've got a kind of left to right is earlier to later, right? So this is a kind of temporal branching time model. So we've got like at where I put the now point, you can imagine somebody flipping a coin there, and I don't know, one branch is heads, the other branch is tails, and then they flip it again, and something like that. Like Kripke talks about exactly this sort of model in the beginning of Naming and Necessity. It was dice rolling, I think, but it's sort of easier to draw if you think about binary bifurcation instead of having 6 branches at each point. Now, what the point of this is that if, like Rob, you think that the kind of analysis of causal powers, or the analysis of modality, is that they're sort of grounded in objects' causal powers, which is how I think Rob talks about it. That seems to me that you're thereby committed to some model like this, where what's going on is all of the possible worlds overlap with each other at some point in the past. Right? Every possible world overlaps. Every pair of possible worlds overlap with each other at some point in the past. Or another way to say that is every possible world overlaps with the actual world at some point. Right? And what's going on is we've got this mean, I quite like this view as well, like sorts of ways into it, but I think penny dropped for me reading a paper by Kit Fine, I think it's a 1994 paper, something and modality, whatever. I can get the reference if anyone's super interested. But there, his idea is he's still complaining that a lot of the time when we talk about possibilities, it's a very abstract and global picture that we start with. Like it's a possible world is the thing, kind of basic unit of modality. It's a whole world, a kind of universe all on its own. And he kind of wants to flip that around and say, no, look, possible worlds are not important. What's important is the kind of constituent objects that the bearers of the modal properties themselves. Right? So on this kind of Lewisian picture where possible worlds are the currency of modality, then what you've got is the objects that are within those worlds are modally flat or modally thin, right? So like, it's possible for me to say have more hair than I currently do, but only in virtue of the fact that there's a similarity relation between me and some counterpart in another possible world who has more hair. The modal property is just this relational two-place property. But someone like Fine or Rob or myself, for purposes of this, are going to say, no, look, objects have thick modal properties, so it's not just in virtue of like some counterpart somewhere else in a disconnected, possibly abstract possible world. It's really me here, right now, that has this property of being, I could go left or I could go right, that kind of thing. So if you follow all of that type of stuff, then naturally a picture like this branching thing is how you should cash it out. I'm thinking that what's going on with this, and the particular model that I have in mind is a beginningless version of this branching structure. So it's just a dotted line over on this right-hand side, left-hand side, to indicate that it's just turtles all the way down, like branching all the way back into the past. Branching is only ever towards the future. It's an Aristotelian idea about possibilities being in the future, not in the past, or even in the present. It's too late to do anything about stuff that's presently true. Every branch overlaps with every other branch at some point, so that means that there's no sort of free-floating branches that don't connect with the trunk at any point. And the basic analysis of modality would be, necessarily P if and only if P is true in every branch in the tree. We can get a lot more technical about that. I see the yellow complaints. We can get a lot more technical about that, but we don't need to for the purposes of this. Quite happy to get more technical if Rob asks me a question that requires it, but I think I can just stop. So why am I bringing this model up? I think it's just for the audience to keep it in mind. I'll be bringing it back up later. But just have this picture in your head, a branching tree. Possibility, metaphysical possibility is being true in every branch. And every possible world that overlaps with every other one, and there's no beginning to it. Right? But those are the properties of this model. It's one version of what it means for there to be no. If you think about the nodes on this as being events, like effects and causes, then if it's beginningless, that just means it's an example of there being no first cause. Anyway, I see the red card, so I'll shut up now.
Well, thank you for a very good and timely opening statement. I think we all appreciated it. So with that, we will now move to Rob's first rebuttal. So Rob, take it away.
Yeah, I just want to thank Alex for those kind words at the beginning and reciprocate them. I think he and Joe Schmidt and Philippe and others are doing bang up work on their side, and keeps us natural theologians on our sharpened and on our toes, and that's a good thing. We welcome that kind of dialogue. And I think that what we've got is really going to be. Oh, sorry. Yeah, great. I think we really are going to be able to focus for the rest of our time on a fairly tight set of issues, and so maybe we can make a little progress, at least in terms of mutual understanding on some of those issues, rather than going off in 1,000 different directions in our discussion. So the kind of approach that I'm defending is a broadly Thomistic approach, building on Thomas Aquinas in various ways. And even though I have a Kalam-like argument, I use it in a very non-Kalam-like way, right? So from my perspective, the issue really isn't, did the universe begin to exist at some point in time? And even if the universe had existed forever, and even if the Kalam part is wrong and there's an infinite regress within the universe, that doesn't affect the first cause argument at all for Thomas, right? He thought that was metaphysically possible, certainly conceivable, but he thought that nonetheless we were driven to a non-temporal cause of the entire temporal universe, whether it's beginningless or not, right? And so I actually find myself in, again, there's a lot of interesting sort of Aristotelian common ground between Alex and me, which is great, actually, again. So we're not, I probably agree more with Alex than I do with Richard Swinburne, for example, about a lot of these issues. So in a way, there's a lot of good common ground that we can work on. And I find the, properly understood, this argument about material causation is absolutely right. I agree with it. So if something inside time is causing something else, a material thing, to begin to exist at some point in time, then this is what Aristotelians call generation of a substance, right? Whenever that happens, there's always a material cause that the agent is acting upon, right? But that's only true for agents acting within time, right? For a non-temporal agent, an eternal agent, there's no reason, I think, to talk about a pre-existing material cause. And I'd argue that, look, all the empirical evidence we have for this material causation principle is based on looking at agents acting within time rather than timelessly. So that would be my first move on that point. But even if you said no, look, forget that, we got to insist that even God has got to work on some kind of material cause. Then here's a dilemma, I guess, for Alex, right? Let's suppose that there's some kind of maybe you'll disagree with this, but suppose there's some sort of ultimate material cause, what Aristotle would call prime matter, right? And a kind of material cause that doesn't itself have a material cause. Aristotle himself certainly thought there had to be such a thing. You can't have an infinite regress of material causation. That thing will either be causable or uncausable, right? If it's causable, then we have an exception to the material causation principle, right? Because it's got to be caused to exist without any prior material cause, because there isn't, by stipulation, any prior material cause for the existence of prime matter. On the other hand, if it's uncausable, then by my definition, it's not part of the universe, right? And therefore, it's part of this first cause, namely God plus the prime matter, resulting in the universe that we see. Now, we might say, well, but that's not a good, I'm a Christian, right? And I'm supposed to believe in creation ex nihilo, at least as a possibility. But I think there's some subtle issues here, actually, because, prime matter, from Aristotle's point of view, I would say, is not really a concrete entity that has actual existence of its own. It's much more of a kind of abstract principle. And so it seems to me there's room even for a theist to acknowledge that there's a kind of pre-existing prime matter, maybe a kind of counterpart to God's omnipotence, which is something whose potentialities he actualizes in causing the universe to exist. So I think there's room here for a theist to come closer to Plato's Timaeus than you might think, even in contemporary Christian terms. So one last point about the. So how much does that mean? I have 1 minute or 1 minute? Yeah, great. I do want to say something about the branching actualism thing too, the branching model that he gave. And again, I'm totally on board with that, actually, right? So we're very much in agreement, with one proviso, one difference, right? And that is, I think that the branches have to represent causal priority rather than temporal priority. So it's quite possible, I think, that you could have a branching tree that goes back infinitely far in time, and then causally, prior to that whole tree, a more fundamental root, right, which is the cause of the entire tree, right? And that root could have the power to produce a number of different alternative trees, right, including the actual one. So anyway, that's this tweaked model that I'd want to defend myself.
Okay, so on the Aristotelian argument, right, on the prime mover argument, I do find it quite difficult to get my head around what's at stake at some parts of it. So I think the easiest way for me to offer a critique of it is along the following lines. So yeah, so I think what I want to say is that the argument is very theory laden. Right? What I mean by that is that there's a lot of assumptions that are built into basically stating the premises, and there's a kind of logical and a dialectical consequence to that type of theory ladenness. Right? The logical consequence of that, logical in a broad sense of the word, is that there's just lots of ways the argument can go wrong. I mean, there's lots of propositions, and so if any of them are false, then goodbye to those premises. Essentially. So in that sense, it's kind of vulnerable to some of those things breaking or not working properly. Dialectically speaking, the consequence is that, unless your interlocutor agrees with you about all of those things, it's not going to be persuasive to them. So a good argument in terms of the dialectic would be one that makes hardly any assumptions that are controversial, and if it does, it makes those ones only that your interlocutor agrees with. So from a dialectical point of view, it just seems to me that there's lots of room to wiggle around here. And let me be a bit more specific about it. I wrote down 9 different, it seemed to me, ontological commitments that were examples of this type of thing. Let me just read out the list I wrote. So Rob said that to be causeable means to be of such a kind that it's conceivable that things of that kind might have a cause. But then this strikes me as a controversial claim in the following way. Right? It means that Bob's saying that causation has some subjective element to it, right? Because what's conceivable is subjective. Because what's conceivable to me is different to what's conceivable to my dog, say, or it's in the eye of the beholder. He also says that causation is not intrinsically temporal. Obviously, some people deny that as well. He says that causation gives direction to the arrow of time. And also, it seems to me that he thinks that there's some explanatory benefit in that. And both of those two things, I think, could be challenged. He also says every group of causable things has a joint cause. And it just seems to me flat false. I think maybe I'm misunderstanding what's at stake. But I think I can understand that in 2 different ways. In one of them, anyway, it sounds flat and false. The other way would be super interesting to come back to, though. So I would like to talk more about that later. Causes do not necessitate their effects. I mean, it's true. Okay, so it's Anscombe's view, but it strikes me that what's going on if we say that causes don't necessitate their effects is that what we're doing is backing away from the strong metaphysical notion of causation that's relevant here to something weaker and less tangible and ultimately not that relevant. So maybe again I'm seeing things wrong, but it's always struck me that this requires quite a strong notion of causation, and if we back off that, it might make life easier, but it's at the cost of changing the topic or something. We've also used this phrase that puzzled me: principles of universal causation are axioms of reason, and I suppose that's a sort of poetic way of explaining what he meant later on by the argument, the kind of skeptical challenge that comes in by denying a causal principle. If that's okay, if that's what that phrase means, then that's fine. Otherwise, it sounds like a kind of Boolean idealization of the notion of axioms of reason or something like that. I don't really like that. Just a couple of others. Time is the measure of change. Okay, that's Aristotle's idea, but it's hardly an unchallenged statement, right? Time could also be, and has also been seen as just a kind of dimension, right? That's another way of looking at it. It doesn't have to be seen as a measure of change at all. But you can say this explicitly, but it seems to me that built into the argument from the first mover argument is that temporal passage is real, and obviously that's a controversial statement. He also said every change must have a cause, but that seems to me to imply a regress. So those are 10 I don't know, things that you could question about the prime mover argument, and I've used all my time just listing those pretty much. Obviously, there's another 2 arguments, very difficult to rebut or even outline the things that you might want to say about 3 arguments in 7 minutes or whatever we're doing here. So apologies for not getting through that. Can I just very quickly I do have a dilemma. It struck me just before we started recording, so maybe this is badly formed, but let me try and say. You said both at the beginning of your statement, two sentences which seem to me to immediately get yourself stuck in a kind of Grimm-style Kantorian argument. I'm sure you will be able to explain why this is wrong. But look, you say the universe is a totality of all causable things, but also that the universe is a causable thing. But doesn't that mean that it's a member of itself in some way that stops there being a kind of meaningful totality? Right? Like, let's say all of the causable things is some set C, but now the set C is a causable thing, so it's in itself. So that means that you didn't specify C in the first place. So we've got this kind of like Kantorian argument about, could there be a set of all truths, for instance, and he thinks that kind of explodes because, there'd be some truth about what was in the set of all truths or whatever. So that seems to me one issue. Nate hasn't waved the red flag at me yet, so I'm just going to say, well, a very final thing, which was, okay, there comes the red flag. Okay, so I'll hold on to this one last point, and we'll bring it up later on.
So if I could respond to that last point about the Grimm-like paradox. So I don't think it's going to be a problem. Those sort of paradoxes almost always involve more abstract propositional-like objects, like a class of all propositions or all truths. Whereas in this case, I'm really just aggregating a bunch of concrete things. So if you allowed me, I'm being a little bit careful here, but if you allowed me like universal mereological composition, we could just say the universe is just the sum of all the causable things, and then I could argue that sum would itself be causable, and so that wouldn't be a problem because everything's a part of itself in standard mereology, right? You don't get any kind of a set-like, Frege-like paradox out of that, I don't think.
Well, what if I asked you how many plausible things there were, and you said it was like n many, and then, are you counting the universe in that set when you said n? Isn't it n plus 1?
Yeah. So suppose there were 3 atomic causable things, right? And let's say we had universal composition, so there'd be 3 more things, including the whole. So now there'd be 6 things altogether that are causable.
And because of the joint, like you think every proper part is causable, so we've got to count all of the subsets as well, right? So is that? It just sounds very much like a Grimm argument. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing the point, but I'm not really seeing how that escapes it. But.
Right. No, I think we can use mereology here rather than set theory. Is my point, right? Because we're dealing with a concrete object. And so now there's no, there are, if something's composite, there'll be proper parts, right, of it, and but you don't get a Russell-like or Frege-like paradoxes. Is the idea, right? So suppose I said, suppose I said that Russell is the sum of all the things that aren't parts of themselves, right? Well, everything's a part of itself, so there's nothing, so there's no sum either, right? No problem, no contradiction, right? It's only because set theory has the power to create the empty set, right? And to create a kind of hierarchy of sets that you get into this kind of problem. This was the whole idea, really. When Goodman and others really started pushing mereology in the mid-20th century, it was precisely because they saw this can avoid Russell's paradox. This will be the way to do aggregation without any kind of paradox. So I think I can employ that kind of strategy here.
Okay, that sounds perfectly fine to me then. And as I said, I only thought about it like very recently, so I'm not sure I've got a huge amount more to say on that. So maybe we can. Also, talking about that seems to take us away from probably some of the other central things that we might want to focus on instead.
Yeah. On your bigger point about the dialectical situation, I think you're right, really. My own approach is much more one of seeing certain theological or proto-theological consequences of what seems to me the best metaphysical theory, And I just sort of put that out there. And if you don't like that metaphysical theory, okay, it's not my job to try to persuade everybody of everything. So yeah, I accept that all these arguments involve contentious, but I think clearly right assumptions. So.
Okay, all right. So, I mean, okay, so on that argument for motion then, I mean, are you just saying, well, if somebody's convinced that, for instance, that they're, like a committed B theorist or something, they just, because they shrug off the idea that there really is any temporal passage, then there's nothing to explain, right? So there's nothing to worry about.
Yeah, I actually don't think it depends on the A theory, the argument. I think it would be a problem for a B theorist too, if they're the right kind of B theorist, right? So if I think the more fundamental question here is whether time is ultimately a kind of space-like dimension or not, right? If time is just a space-like dimension, then there's no question, right? If time involves some kind of progressive actualization of potentials or something like that, even if you're a B theorist, then there's a question as to why this temporal dimension keeps going, right? Why doesn't it stop at some particular point, or why does it ever get going at all in the first place? So I think if you have that kind of any kind of dynamic conception of time, then and you think that time, and therefore that time depends in some sense on change, it's sort of measurement of change, then there's at least an interesting question here, which is why does time keep flowing? Why does it keep moving forward? Why does it keep going in that direction continuously? Ideally, at least, we would like to have some explanation of that. I think ultimately we need a causal explanation. But then, as I argued very briefly, any causation within time of the forward motion of time will ultimately be viciously circular, involve a kind of kind of vicious circularity. So therefore, the sort of engine that keeps time going must be something outside of time. And I think this is clearly what Aristotle has in mind in physics when he talks about the prime mover, because it's important for him that the prime mover not only be unchanging, but that it be unchangeable, because it's a being of pure actuality, as he puts it. So it has no passive potentialities whatsoever, and so it's incapable of being changed, and therefore it can cause change without itself changing. Maimonides picks this up as well, I think. It's very important in Aristotle's picture, actually. There's one last thing, right? That agents don't change qua changing something else, right? When Aristotle talks about the passion occurring, or the action occurring in the patient, what he means is that the agent doesn't change in causing the change in the patient, except sort of accidentally. So in our world, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So in the sublunar world, at least for Aristotle, it's true that if one thing causes something else to change, it's also going to be caused to change itself. But at the limit, that's not the case, right? It's certainly conceivable for him that that agent cause change without itself changing at all.
Okay, so that's helpful. It does seem to. If we circle back a little bit to the question that seems to be on the table was like, so time seems to be passing, stuff happening, whatever. And then there's this puzzle which you pose as something like, how come it keeps going? Right? Why doesn't it just sort of stop now or something? And it would be nice to have some explanation for that. So it just seemed that, like, somebody could, without being completely irrational, think, well, it's necessary. Right? If there's anything metaphysically necessary, it's the passage of time. And it couldn't be otherwise. Right? Why doesn't it go backwards? You might also wonder. Well, it couldn't be, you might say. Right? I'm not saying that that's definitely true, but it does seem like reasonable to think that's right. I don't know how anyone ever establishes anything as a metaphysical principle, apart from just positing it and seeing how it feels. But that doesn't seem completely irrational to me. So there's another option on the table. The question is just, why is it better to suppose, what have we done on your view? Well, we've appealed to an agent that's doing the causing. How come time keeps passing? Because the first cause makes it continue to pass or something. Well, okay, but why does he do that? why can't I ask that question? If I can ask that question, it seems to me that aren't you going to say, well, I kind of has to, or something? Aren't we just back at the same answer with just a little detour via a new ontological entity to arrive at the same appeal to necessity at the end of the day anyway? So if that's right, which I guess you're going to dispute that, because if that's right, it's a kind of Oppy-like argument, right? Because it seems to me that we get the same stuff, but you have to appeal to more entities to do so. In which case, it seems like a kind of theoretical downside to what you're saying. But I see that you get the point. So maybe you have to respond.
Yeah, no, I see the move there. So my methodology says something like this: we should avoid brute necessities as much as possible. So to say that something's necessary, if we can find an explanation for why it's necessary, that's always preferable. So even if that involves introducing additional entities. So there may be a sort of deep methodological difference there. But also in this particular case, right, it seems to me that the forward motion of time, if Aristotle's right that time is a measure of change, that really means the forward motion of change, the perpetual continuity of change itself. And here it seems to me we have pretty good commonsensical / empirical reason to think that changes have causes, right? And so the primordial change that's occurring at each moment in time, those primordial changes ought to have some kind of cause. They can't have a temporal cause, so therefore they must have a non-temporal cause. I think that's the structure of the argument.
Yeah, I guess so now here's another sort of view which would be sort of thinner perspective, where someone would just say, look, changes is just like a proposition having a truth value at some time and a different truth value at a different time, right? That's all changes, and it doesn't matter if it's forwards or backwards. Change is change, right? So you're asking for an explanation for something that I don't need in my theory. Like if I take that view of things, you're asking for how come change rolls along this in this dynamic fashion in this direction, whatever. But you might just think, well, that's not part of my theory, in which case your argument has no appeal to me. Right? So unless I buy into a lot of that stuff, this is why it goes back to my theory labeling point again. If you're like a Russellian about change and time, you're just not going to buy that bit of the argument.
Right, exactly. No, I think that's right. And that's just exactly the kind of B theory I was talking about earlier, right? So if you combine with your B theory a kind of at theory of change, this Russellian definition of change, then this argument has no purchase. But that's wrong. That's really a bad counter change, right? I mean, it's intuitively wrong, right, for the reasons that McTaggart brings up, right? I mean, you've got this rod. It's hot on one end and cold on the other end. You don't think that's an instance of change, right? Why not, right? There's something special about change that involves something more than just different properties being located at different indices, right? And also that gives you no sense to the arrow of time, right? And certainly no local fundamental kind of arrow of time, and that seems like really problematic. So I'm happy enough to say yes, it's theory laden. This is really good theory. So if you're an at theorist, let's have a debate about that. Let's discuss that. I think you're right.
Yeah, and I don't want to die on that hill, right? That's a different debate. I was just sort of flagging that there are views out there.
Absolutely.
And also this idea about the direction of time being explained in terms of the direction of causality, which ultimately, I guess, is you're saying the direction of time is explained by the direction of change, basically.
Right.
I kind of want to outline the same move again. I mean, someone could just say, look, it's necessary that change happens in this direction. And then you say, no, hold on here, let me explain it to you. I'm going to appeal to causation. And now that gives me some kind of purchase on why time rolls forwards in that direction, because that's where causation goes. But then they could say, well, how come causation points in that direction? And if you say, well, it just does, then again, you're back to the same appeal to necessity, and it's to fire a detour again. Right? So it's the same move, but different subject.
Right. But I mean, just to be ad hominem here for a bit, going back to the branching actualism kind of picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why does it always branch in the one direction and not in the other, right? So there has to be some kind of deeper I think, explanation as to why it works that way. And I think it's because of the asymmetry of causation itself, right? The way in which causal powers work. Once you understand what a causal power is, in particular what a passive power, potentiality is, you immediately see it has a direction, right? So it's not. I don't think it's a brute necessity. I think it's much more of a kind of finding an essential property here.
Well, I mean, you could have the branches going in both directions. I think Bryce DeWitt has a version of, some quantum mechanical interpretation where, the history is indeterminate just as much as the future. Right? I mean, I don't know if that's true, because I don't even get the idea. I don't even understand how it's supposed to be true, but that might just be my shortcomings of that. But just to flag as well, I mean, this is different hats, right? When I'm defending the model that I was talking about before, I'm buying into basically all of these assumptions for purposes of illustrating something. While I've got my nitpicker's hat on, I'm going to say, those things to be questioned, and they're part of the theory later point. So I think you probably flogged that horse a little bit. Maybe. So on my argument, you were basically just saying, yeah, that's okay, it works, but only for material objects that are, as it were, in the universe already, right?
Yeah, I guess it's when the agent, the cause of the creation, as you put it, of the new thing is itself in time, then yes, that always holds.
Oh, I see. But then, if the agent is outside of time, then how does that? So we go back to the dry heaving thought experiment or intuition pump. I mean, how does it help to suppose that the agent is able to dry heave lunch on an empty stomach if he's not in time?
Right. So suppose we've got a beginningless universe. Okay. So there's no first moment of time. It just goes back infinitely far into the past, right? So, but nonetheless, there's an extra-temporal, non-temporal cause of the whole shebang, right? Non-temporally causing the whole shebang. Well, there doesn't seem to be any need for it to act on any pre-existing material there, because the matter is always there for every new thing that emerges, right? So it looks as though in this case, the non-temporal cause is the cause of the matter as well as of the individual things that make it up. And since it's not acting in time, I think our reasons for thinking that there must be a pre-existing. See, the whole idea of pre-existing would have to be, in this case, would have to be causally prior material cause, and I don't think there's any reason in this case to think that should be the case.
Right. So, and when we talk about cause, according to your opening, just sort of hold it to it. You said, what do I mean by cause? I mean this. If X is cause of Y, then X had the power to make it the case that Y existed. But I guess I'm struggling because there's material and God's related to it in a kind of atemporal way. I'm not saying he's like at the beginning of time, maybe a bit like Craig does or something where he thinks he's in time at the moment of creation. You're just saying maybe he's outside of time, so an atemporal being, and he nonetheless has a causal relation to the material of the universe. And let's say you grant me that it's like infinitely, it has no beginning or something. Still, you're going to say there's a first cause because God makes all of that exist. But nonetheless, isn't the whole of materiality? I'm going to play your card right now. Whole of materiality is a material object, is it not? And in which case, how does God make it? When God causes it to exist, right? He is not doing so out of pre-existing material. That material just simply comes to be.
I mean, arguably, if the universe began to exist in time, then that would be the case. But not otherwise. I mean, I guess I do think there's a distinction between the two principles, and so maybe I'm pushing back against the Morrison symmetry argument here. That I think that the argument, the principle that there has to be a cause of some kind, that I think is a priori, kind of really fundamentally rational principle. Whereas I think the assumption there has to be material causes is much more empirical. it's because our best physics shows us that whenever there's something comes into existence, there's some kind of pre-existing material that applies to it. But then there's no reason to think that this empirically supported generalization is going to apply to something totally different from what we've experienced or can even experience empirically, namely the action of a non-temporal agent. So I just think there's less reason to apply it there. But even if you did, as I said, I mean, we could always say, okay, fine, then let's say there is some kind of uncausable material thing that the first cause acts on to create the universe. That's fine. I think it's still going to be, it's still going to support my claim, because if the stuff is uncausable, right, then it's not going to be part of the universe.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I had in mind, some more radical moves might be that you think that God uses some of his own substance, kind of translates some of his own mental substance into material in order to, so it's not really making it out of nothing, already existed. It's just sort of like transmogrifying, or whatever. Maybe he doesn't know that. But I think that's probably heretical or something to suppose that God, the universe is made out of the same substance as God. He's just rearranging it. It starts sounding like Spinoza or something at that point. So I just assumed that you were going to stick well clear with that type of hypothesis, right?
Right. No, I think that's right. I think the first active cause, the first agent cause, will not itself be material. It would have to be immaterial because it's uncausable. So if there is this primordial matter that's uncausable, uncreated, it wouldn't be the matter of God in any sense. It would be something that exists as a kind of necessary correlate to God's power, something like that. But something like his ideas, which are also not either, he's not made up of his ideas or not his matter, but they sort of exist as a necessary correlate of his cognition. And it helps. And I think it also helps on my view that this matter wouldn't really count as a concrete existing thing on this picture. It would be more of a kind of metaphysical factor that figures into the causation of the universe.
Okay, well, I'm happy to sort of park that, because obviously your knowledge of Aristotle's prime matter is greater than mine. I think obviously you're going to understand this, Rob, but for the audience, what is going on here might be a struggle to communicate this properly, but I think that if what we're thinking about is that beginningless branching model that I flashed up on the screen before, where there's no beginning, branching towards the future, no disconnected branches, and what it means for something to be metaphysically necessary is for it to be true in all of those branches, then I think it gives me a principled reason of denying premise 2. Right? So premise 2 here relies on the idea that mathematically possible combinations are metaphysically possible. But what you get out of that model that I was talking about in the first place, if we're saying metaphysically possible means true in some branch in the tree, the two things come apart from each other. Right? What's metaphysically possible now can't be the same as what's mathematically possible. And in particular, what's going on is, if you think about it yourself in the tree, the beginningless tree, and in the actual world, the lucky recorder scenario is true, right? Then Rob's argument asks us to imagine what things would be like if every single event in the past was different to how it actually was. But what that means is to imagine a possible world that doesn't overlap with the actual world at any point in the past. And that's just, therefore, not going to be a possible world. It's a free-floating branch, in which case it's just not metaphysically possible. So in that sense, it just seems to me that your appeal to mathematical recombinations, it doesn't, I have a principled reason of denying that, if what we're talking about is that very model that we had in mind. So maybe some other models, you've got a point, but not for this one. And like I said before, if I've got my nitpicking hat on, I only really need one counterexample to make the point. So yeah, I'll pause there and see what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. So I'd have sort of two responses, I think. One is it goes to this point that you made earlier, which I didn't get a chance to respond to yet, which is the my use of conceivability in the causal principle. So I'm not saying there that causation itself is something subjective or that involves an epistemic relation. I'm just talking about the principle itself. And I think there are good epistemological reasons for thinking that the scope should be not limited to the metaphysically possible, but to the conceivable. And so one could rewrite this whole thing. I thought about doing this, actually, in terms of conceivability rather than possibility, in which case I think something like 1 and 2 are pretty clearly true. So that's one response. And the second response is, I think, actually, that the fundamental motivation of the branching picture does not actually entail that every possible world is exactly like the actual world at some point in the past. Suppose that you had a world that deviates from the actual world in such a way that as you go further back into the past, it converges more and more closely to the actual world, right? So there's like tiny deviations that occur and smaller deviations as you go further back. And in each case, the deviation involves the exercise of some causal power that's in the actual world. So this alternative world would really be, its possibility would really be grounded in the existence of powers in the actual world in the appropriate sort of way, even though it does, it doesn't exactly match the actual world at any point in the past. So I think if you think about that, you'll see that picture would be just as well motivated by this fundamental causal power picture as the one that you suggested.
Okay, so just to try and get that concretely in my head, so let's suppose we've got like a hot coal in the actual world, right? And then there's some, you're supposing that there's some branch where that coal is like, I don't know, even hotter, but it's like temperature is getting closer and closer and closer to the one in the actual world, right? But it never actually, there's no point in time where there's, they just overlap and it's just one coal with, in both possible histories. At the same time.
I think that's pretty close. I have to think about whether that will work. But the thought is that at each point, this other world branches off from something that is very close to the actual world. And as you go further back in time, it gets closer and closer to the actual world. So it branches off by virtue of powers and potentialities that are in the actual world, right? In every case, all the way back, right? I think that will give us a possibility that's still really appropriately grounded in the actual powers of things in the world, even though in that case it doesn't match the actual world perfectly. So just sort of imagine, here's one way to think about it. Think of the Grim Reapers as getting smaller and smaller, right, as you go back in time and occupying a tinier bit of space. So as you go way far back, it looks almost exactly like the actual world, except this little tiny place where there's these little tiny Grim Reapers doing their thing. That seems to me to be still grounding the possibilities in the actual world in the appropriate sort of way. And let's say that in each of these cases, the Grim Reapers that are produced are actually produced by processes in the actual world of some kind, right? Which seems possible. To be honest, I still need to work on this. This is something because I've been reading some of your work and some of the others, and so I think this is a really interesting problem to work on. But it's sketchy. Yeah.
I'm interested to talk more about that, but maybe we need to. It's probably going to require longer than the constraints of this discussion to go into it. But it just, I guess, my spidey senses are tingling because I'm thinking, well, if it really is, producible through the causal effects or whatever of actual things, then there's already going to be a branch in my model for that. If not, then it's not causally, it might look quite like something that could be made through the exercise of causal powers of actual things, but it can't actually be. It must involve some, Lewisian style miracle of deviation from how things should go according to their natures or whatever. In which case, I'm going to say it's not a possible world in this view. So I suppose there's a bit of a dilemma there. It just sort of feels like what you're asking for is to have it both ways, and I can't really get my head around how it can be both of those. But yeah, there may well be some kind of nuance with that.
Yeah, I agree. I need to work on this to see if I can fill this out in a way that's coherent. But my hunch is that it is, but I need to work on it.
Okay. Well, so just to circle back to the notion of conceivability, right? So it strikes me that maybe we're using different terms here and talking past each other, because for me, I just think that I can conceive of anything, right? Like, tell me a thing I can't conceive of, and I'll have conceived of it by the time you finish telling me about it. So I don't understand how anything could be uncausable, according to your definition. I'll just conceive of the number 2 being caused to exist. I can conceive of God being caused to exist, right? How could there be anything that I can't conceive of being caused to exist? So that's what I meant by the problem is that it seems kind of subjective. I mean, I feel like I can conceive of anything. If I literally can't conceive of it, then it feels like it's also incommunicable as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, I wouldn't know what you meant.
Right.
Maybe
I guess what I had in mind
is
what folks have called ideal positive conceivability. I think Chalmers has some stuff on this. So the thought is it's consistent with all of my a priori knowledge.
Yeah, right. But then it's still subjective in the following sense, right? Because like my dog doesn't know anything a priori, probably. Right. So nothing. So what's compatible with her a priori knowledge is anything. So from her point of view, anything is causable. So there's no uncausable things from her point of view. But if I'm unlucky enough to fill my head with loads of a priori knowledge, and suddenly loads of stuff, I would say is now not causable. But surely there's some measuring stick that just decides which of me and my dog is correct here. And why don't we just look at that instead of, trying to measure the world on the basis of my own concepts first? That just seems upside down to me.
Right. So what I'm trying to defend, though, is that this principle is part of the human, inventory of knowledge, so to speak, a priori knowledge. Right. So there is a kind of anthropocentric element to this. Right. What can I know about the world a priori as a human being?
Right. But, okay. So if there's something objective about that, then that feels. I just want to talk about that instead of bypassing through. If there's because you might say, listen, anything is a priori knowable for a human principle, so you can't hang a hat on that. But if you can fix for me what's knowable a priori in advance, then let's just skip all the stuff about a priori knowable and talk about how you figured that out. And maybe that's the thing that's objective.
Well, suppose in fact there's 17 gazillion ergs of energy in the universe, and there's some conservation law, so it's always been exactly 17 gazillion, right? So now it's a metaphysical necessity that it be 17 gazillion. But it seems to me that I can coherently conceive of there being 17 gazillion and 1 ergs of energy, right? So that's a kind of somewhat broader class of scenarios or something, if you want to call it. Which I think, so that I think is what's involved here. Because if I'm going to have an a priori principle of causation, it can't depend on my knowing a bunch of a posteriori facts about what's actually necessary in the universe.
Okay, but I mean, my point is just simply that this is a metaphysical conclusion, right? And that the argument is about metaphysics, and it shouldn't have to rely on appealing to what's a priori knowable. I mean, what's causable is causable regardless of who knows what, isn't it? So it shouldn't matter about what I can know. So I guess maybe I'm just like complaining in an incoherent fashion here, but I just I'm grumbling really. Why are we talking about knowledge? What's this got to do with epistemology? It's about metaphysics. Does the universe have a cause? Surely it can't be that the way to figure that out requires saying stuff about what I can know. It just feels like it must be wrong. But to be fair, I'm not pinpointing anything very precise with that grumble. But I think you know what I'm sort of grumbling about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I see your point. I've said similar things myself at times. I mean, yeah, I need to think about that. I mean, it does seem to me that the argument is really legitimately metaphysical. But if pressed, right, and someone said, "Well, wait, why are you assuming that this causable thing has a cause? This particular thing has a cause?" Then I have to, again, dialectically, resort to epistemology to defend that particular inference.
Yeah,
that's how I would answer
that makes sense. Okay, conscious of time, I know that you've got another appointment in. I think you said in the email that you'd go on for another maybe 15 minutes.
I think, or so. Let's see. Is that right?
So I wonder if we want to give the opportunity for audience questions, if there were any.
Yeah, maybe that's a good idea.
Right. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to open up the floor, and I think I'll begin myself. So I have a question for Rob Koons. Rob, why doesn't your theory, or maybe it does, show there are no actual infinities? That is, why doesn't the Grim Reaper paradox, particularly when paired with other paradoxes like Zeno's paradox, Hilbert's Hotel, tortoise and hare paradox, why don't these show there's no infinity whatsoever? Which is a fairly strong position.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about that as much. I've been focused mostly on this question of causal regress, right? I mean, I don't think the argument has any implications about the future, let's say. So there could be an infinite series of future effects. There's just no way to turn that scenario into a contradiction in the way that the Grim Reaper does.
Well, but here's the implications for the future. I mean, if the Grim Reaper paradox works because there is no infinity, then that's a good reason to think that there's no infinity, which then says, look, your cosmological argument works based on there being no infinity. If you think that the Grim Reaper paradox is consistent with infinity existing, perhaps you should explain why, because I'm not seeing it.
Yeah. So I guess let me put it in terms that I've done in the past, which is to refer to Lewis's sort of patchwork principle kind of picture. So the thought is you've got a one possible world in which there's a causal structure of a certain kind. In this case, let's say an infinite regress is the question, right? Then you've got another possible world where there's a patch that's possible, the individual Grim Reaper, Grim Recorder, right? And then the patchwork principle is supposed to say that there should be then a third possible world where you fit that patch into the places in the framework and you produce your quilt, right? That's the picture. So to get a contradiction out of this, you have to have, in that first world, an infinite causal regress, right? It's got to be the case that this depends on that, which depends on that, and depends on that, and so on ad infinitum. Because when you look at the individual patches, right, they involve the Reaper or Recorder responding to causally prior conditions and producing an effect or failing to produce an effect, right? And then in this case, when we try and do that, we find we get a contradiction, right? And therefore, either the individual patches are not really possible after all, or the structure that we started with is not possible. And my preferred conclusion is that a regress is impossible. Now, if you start it with a world where you have a Grim Reaper 1, Grim Reaper 2, Grim Reaper 3 going forward causally, right, like into the future, right, then there's no paradox, right? Grim Reaper 1 writes his number 1, nobody else does anything, end of story, right? So you just don't get a contradiction without having the temporal or causal direction going in the wrong direction in this particular case. So it's not infinity per se, but it's an infinite regress that's the problematic element, I think.
Well, let me just follow up that, and then I'll a question for Alex. If you think that God is kind of a prime mover outside of time, immutable, I guess my question is, and given that your version of cosmological argument seems to use principle of sufficient reason, does your argument depend on God explaining himself? And if so, how doesn't your argument depend on the ontological argument, particularly the modal ontological argument, in the sense that if God's going to be self-explanatory, then what other than his perfection is going to explain why he necessarily exists and why he exists at all? And if you don't invoke the modal ontological argument, then aren't you introducing a brute fact, which you seem to suggest that you didn't want to do so?
Right. Okay. Those are hard questions, actually. I don't think this particular argument relies on a PSR, principle of sufficient reason, but rather on a principle of universal causation, which is somewhat different. And so the conclusion that I get is that God is uncausable, and that it's inconceivable that a being like that could be caused. So I think it differs from Anselm's argument. I mean, I think Anselm's argument depends on the idea that God's non-existence is inconceivable. And that I'm not claiming. All I'm claiming is that his being caused is inconceivable, right? So that's a...
Fair enough. Just one follow-up to this. But, I mean, you did say you didn't want to introduce brute necessary facts, and presumably you think that God's existence is a necessary fact. So it's either brute or it's not brute. So even if your argument doesn't rely on the principle of sufficient reason, elsewhere you seem to say, look, I don't want to introduce brute necessary facts. So my question is, do you think that God is in fact unexplained? And I'm particularly interested in Anselm's argument as opposed to the modal versions. But my question is, do you think that God is unexplained, that you have kind of an unexplained explainer? Or do you think that God has an explanation, in which case your version of the cosmological argument depends on something explaining God's existence or his nature?
Yeah, good. So I would go with the unexplained explainer option here. And so I think I have to go double check what I said exactly to Alex, but I think what I meant to say was that we want to minimize the cases of brute necessities, right, methodologically. But in this particular case, we know, I think, that there couldn't be an explanation of the existence of this uncausable being. And so therefore, a brute necessity is okay in this particular case.
All right, and then I have a question for Alex. And again, really enjoying the conversation. You guys are outstanding. Alex, just a simple question that you see already in the literature. How would we ever reach the present if the past goes infinitely far back? That is, why think we can traverse an infinite sequence?
I don't really get this objection, to be honest. So, as with most of this stuff, I tend to see it the same way that Wes Morrison does. Right? I think in somewhere, if I could remember exactly, I could give the reference to it. But actually, maybe it's in his AJP paper from a few years ago. Anyway, point is, it just sounds like a restatement of the hypothesis, right? So suppose we're wondering if the past could be beginningless, and someone says, well, it couldn't be beginningless because if it was beginningless, it would have taken you an infinite amount of time to get here. I mean, yeah. The hypothesis is the past is infinite, right? What else does that mean? Of course, that's what it means to say. It's basically saying the same thing again. So unless there's supposed to be some problem with an infinite amount of time passing, but basically that just seems to be the thing that someone who's kicking up dust here needs to establish. And it just seems to me that like what's going on is someone who's appealing to a thing that sounds problematic, but actually it's a sort of like subtly just rearranging the hypothesis without really doing anything to it and asking and then framing it as if that's a problem. Like I don't get what's the problem there.
So here's where I think the problem is. If you make the following assumption that properties are that concrete particulars exemplify properties at a time, and you say, look, going forward, at what point in time, imagine we added quarters into some area, when would we ever reach an infinite number of quarters? Well, the answer is there's no particular time, right? Because at any time you're only adding them in. Now, the problem comes in if you're saying, look, this stuff is exemplified when, not at any time, and you don't think the properties can, in fact, be exemplified outside of time. So that's the problem. That's why it's not begging the question whatsoever, in my claim. It's just saying, look, if we assume, and if you think that a concrete particular can exemplify a property but not at a time, I just wonder if you could explain that, please.
So I think what's going on is there's a subtle move. It's sort of baked into the way people talk about this argument. It's really difficult to disentangle the two things. But let me just grant, for the sake of the argument, that it's not possible to start with no quarters, add one at a time, and arrive at some point in time where there's more than some finite number of quarters. So let's just say that that's true. Still, what seems to me nothing about the past follows from that, right? I mean, you still have to do some work to explain to me how it couldn't have been that forever I was adding quarters to an infinitely big jar, and and there's infinitely many quarters in there. I mean, on that hypothesis, yesterday there was also infinitely many quarters, so the day before that as well, blah blah blah. But like, where's the contradiction? I mean, I don't see it. So it's like the puzzlement, it seems to me, is how could I start counting now and arrive at infinity? But that's not the problematic. That's not the thing that's relevant. The thing that the thing that should be at stake is explaining why it's impossible to have always been counting down and arrive at zero today, and that just requires a different type of argument.
So I like your point. I think it's a really good point, but I'm not seeing it. I mean, I would think there's a symmetry between the future and the past, and whether you're counting down or counting up, I'm not sure why that matters. But the underlying metaphysical premise is that a concrete particular exemplifies a property at a time. If that's the case, and if we could not reach an infinite amount going forward, and if the future and the past are symmetrical, which in this case they are, and I don't see it matters whether you're counting up or counting down, I don't see why the fact that we could not have an infinite number of quarters in the future shows that we can't start out with an infinite number of quarters and count down to 0 quarters.
Well, let's think about it in this way. Maybe this is helpful. Because let's say it's completely symmetrical, the past and the future have the same sort of topology or whatever, right? That there's no difference between them in that sense. And I don't think there's really anything different about counting up to counting down, right? But what's important is and here's a completely general fact, if you've got a set of things like natural numbers, right, where they're discrete objects. Now, you can have, that set could have infinitely many things in if it's open, if it's an open set in both directions, right? So there's no first moment, your first element and no last one, or it could be infinite if there's a first element but no last one, or it could be infinite if there's a last one but no first one. But it couldn't be infinite. This is all that really matters. It couldn't be infinite if it was bounded at both ends and it was discrete elements like that, right? Not continuous. So if I'm counting up, I know that it's bounded at this end, at the beginning. So it couldn't be bounded at the other end, the sort of infinite end. It just couldn't be infinite in that case, because mathematics tells you that much. So if I start counting, I'm definitely not going to finish counting infinity, right? But symmetrically, if I finish counting now, counting down today at 0, then it couldn't have been that there's an infinitely distant starting point, because that would be to bound the set at both ends. So we just said it's discrete, but you couldn't have an infinite, doubly bounded discrete set of things. So I do agree, it's not about some kind of implausible asymmetry, it's just a mathematical fact, a set theoretical fact that underlies what I'm saying, I think. And Rob's nodding in agreement, so that's a good
sign. I think that's right. This is why I don't rely on this kind of argument at all, because it seems to me that it is begging an important question or something, that is kind of assuming that if there were an infinite past and there's some infinitely distant event back there where I had an infinite number of numbers or something and I had to start counting. And that's just not the way it's supposed to work, right? It's that at every point in the past, I'm some finite distance from the present, right? Just without any upper bound. So that seems to me coherent, actually. I don't see a problem there.
Okay. Well, I have a question with regard to Rob. As a side note, I like you guys' point, but I'm still not seeing why this is consistent with a property being exemplified at a time. But leaving that aside, my question for Rob is, why think you've suggested that causation is necessary but not sufficient, and I'm just not seeing why that is. So I guess that's one question, and then a related question is, I mean, you're not using the principle of sufficient reason. You're using the principle of sufficient causation, but I'm not sure why if we use the principle of sufficient reason, why this would allow for free will or responsibility. So two questions. Why is causation necessary but not sufficient? And second, why think that if we had the principle of sufficient reason, that doesn't prevent there from being libertarian free will, and on a theist account, then responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that was kind of a very oversimplified thing to say. What I really mean is that if something's causable, it's necessary that there be a cause. But that I want to deny that given the cause, the effect necessarily follows. And as you say, free will would be a good example, right? So if I have a situation where I've got libertarian free will, which I believe in, I've got really good reasons to order a chocolate ice cream and equally good reasons to order vanilla ice cream, and I order one or the other, then the causal principle is satisfied, right? There was something that was the causal precursor of my choice, namely my having good reason to order vanilla ice cream. That's adequate as an explanation of my doing so, even though I could just as easily have ordered chocolate instead, right? And of course, that's the way I think of God's causation of the universe as well. That God has lots of good reasons to create lots of different things. There's no best possible world in my picture. He's got good reasons to create any one of an infinite number of worlds, and he does create one of them, and that's that. He's acting for a good reason. He's not caused to choose that in any way. He's simply acting in light of the value of what he's doing. But he's the cause, but clearly, in my view, he could have existed and not caused anything at all. He's also got pretty good reason to do that. So
I like your response. I mean, definitely a powerful one, but I'm not sure I'm seeing it. So imagine we have the principle of sufficient reason rather than principle of sufficient causation, and we say, well, the person has an equally strong reason, understood either in terms of justification or in terms of motivation, to choose chocolate as vanilla, and you say, well, the person chooses chocolate, and I say, what's the contrastive explanation? In virtue of what did the person choose chocolate rather than vanilla? Especially if we're looking for an explanation that's going to be responsibility grounding. And I'm not sure that you've given one. You just said, well, look, a person has as good a reason to do one rather than the other, but why haven't you failed to provide an explanation which satisfies PSR in virtue of the absence of a contrastive explanation, number one? And number two, in the absence of contrastive explanation, why haven't you failed to give a responsibility grounding explanation?
yeah.
And then I'm going to apply this to God, because I think the same thing. Why did God create this world rather than a better or worse one? There's an infinite sequence of them. I'm going to use exactly the same argument to show that PSR is going to make, it's not going to allow us to provide a contrastive explanation as to why God chose this world, number one. And even if it did, it wouldn't allow for God's being responsible for his creation.
Right. Yeah, so I think we have to be very careful here about how to understand contrastive. If by contrastive you mean necessitating, then I'm rejecting that. I don't think you need a necessitating explanation to have an explanation. But if by contrastive you mean there's got to be something that explains this rather than that, then there is in this particular case. So I choose chocolate. Chocolate is good. The goodness of chocolate is a contrastive explanation of my choosing chocolate rather than vanilla. Doesn't give me any reason to choose vanilla, right? Gives me a reason to choose chocolate. Now, it's also true that vanilla is good, right? So there's also sitting out there an explanation for choosing vanilla if I had chosen vanilla, but I didn't. So I think there's always an explanation, and in a certain sense, it's a contrastive explanation. It's an explanation for this action rather than any other, but it's not a necessitating explanation.
Yeah, just one follow-up, and then I'll ask Alex a question. So there's a really interesting question. But assuming that the reason precedes the choice, it seems you have a backtracking case. In virtue of the fact that you chose chocolate, that meant that you had a sufficient explanation of it. Had you chose vanilla, you'd have a sufficient explanation of that. But the choice follows the reason. So isn't that a backtracking account? And if it's not, I'm just not seeing the contrastive explanation. In virtue of what did the person explains why the person chose chocolate or vanilla? And the same thing applies to God. Why would God have chosen this world when there's an infinite number of better ones and an infinite number of worse ones?
Yeah. So it's not backtracking because my choosing the chocolate didn't make it the case that chocolate was good. So it's clearly just going in the one direction.
But it did follow the fact that the reason preceded the decision.
So I had reasons to do many things, right? And I acted on one of those reasons, and that's an adequate explanation of my action.
And just a quick question for Alex, and then I think we'll sort of wind this down. I really appreciate you guys doing a great job, and it's really a pleasure to be on podcast with the two of you. Alex, I'm wondering, what do you think about the Grim Reaper paradox? Do you think that is...
Okay, so I was talking in this discussion earlier on about how if we consider the model that I presented, this beginningless branching model, then what happens is there's a kind of distinct theory of what's metaphysically possible falls out of that. And that's the point of this model. It's a possible worlds model. It tells you something about what's possible and what's not. And it just follows from that if the actual world, though being beginningless, isn't filled with Grim Reapers, one every year, waiting to kill Fred if none of the previous ones have, right? If that's not actual, then there's no possible world in which that's actual, because every possible world overlaps with the actual world at some point. So, like, I could go back an arbitrary number of years and imagine, starting from that point, that there were Grim Reapers every year going forwards. So for any n, there can be n many Grim Reapers. Right? That's my theory. I'm quite happy with that. But you just can't insist that absolutely every past day or every past year was different to how it actually was. And I think that this makes it a very interesting model, actually, because it has this kind of like Brouwer-esque sort of finitism built into it. Right? So I can sort of accommodate what might be your intuitions, something like, but it seems to me that every day could be different, right? Well, I'll give you any n number of days, but all I'm holding back on is that absolutely every single day could be different, right? It's just a sort of property that falls out of the model. The model is independently motivated and attractive, so it gives me some reason to think that this is right. I mean, even if it's not right, I mean, it seems like a possibility that's sitting on the table, and if that's there, it kind of blocks one of the key premises in the Grim Reaper argument. So that's how the Grim Reaper argument can be sort of foiled. Well, one way, I mean, there's a few of us who've been working on a load of different arguments. This is one of the things I was saying at the beginning about how influential Rob's work is. It's sort of stimulated a bunch of us to spend a lot of our intellectual time coming to terms with the things that he was saying, right? So it's the best compliment in the world as a philosopher if another philosopher disagrees with you and takes the time to try and like explore why. And that's what's going on here. In addition to this branching kind of objection, me and Joe recently published another paper on this, which is about the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. We don't have enough time to explain that now. There's, if you just look at Joe's Phil Papers profile, you'll see about 16 different reasons why you might deny some premise or other in the Grim Reaper. I mean, here's another cute one that I can explain very quickly. Rob's argument, the Grim Reaper argument, has one of the premises is that the combination principle is true, right? And that's the sort of thing that you'd think if you were a Humean about necessity and necessary connections between things, right? If you're a Humean, you don't think there are any necessary connections between things, so you have this like, you can cut and paste almost anything with anything else, it doesn't matter, the result will be possible. But if you're an Aristotelian, a non-Humean, then you deny that, right? You don't think you can just cut and paste everything together. So Aristotelian has got reason to reject the patchwork principle, and obviously Rob does, and he only accepts a quite strongly modified version of it himself, being an Aristotelian. But it's just the point is that, like, Aristotelian isn't going to buy that premise. But then there's another premise, right, which is thoroughly Aristotelian in nature, which a Humean would reject, which is that the Grim Reapers have these kind of intrinsic causal powers. Right? So they don't just have a causal power in virtue of being related to a counterpart in another possible world. They really do have them, right? This sort of localized bit of space-time with a Reaper in it, sort of modally fit. But of course, the Humean is going to reject that. They're not going to think that that's true. So, plausibly, everyone's either a Humean or an anti-Humean. Right? You either think there are necessary connections between distinct existences or you don't. But in either case, you've got a premise to deny in the argument. Now, I'm not saying that that's, it's cute, right? I think that we could have had a whole conversation just about that. But, there's various approaches to it. But as I said before, that's not to say that the argument is stupid or anything like that. It's a compliment when there's a battery of people standing, a battery of arguments being levelled against a position. Right? Consider David Lewis's possible worlds theory. Everybody's got their own pet reason for thinking that there can't all be concrete possible worlds, but nonetheless, it's one of the most influential theories in philosophy, and it's certainly in the 20th century. And he's one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. So, yeah.
So just so I followed your response, you said that you think, look, the Grim Reaper paradox in fact relies on an impossibility. And the impossibility that you rely on is an impossibility that is different from the impossibility of infinity. Is that a fair statement? Because
right.
of course, and which particular impossibility that's not dependent on infinity are you relying on to show that the Grim Reaper paradox relies on an impossible state of affairs?
Well, that probably isn't quite how I would say it, but if I just go back to the first point, right, which, and I may have confused things by bringing in two different objections there, but go back to the model that I gave. I'm just saying on that model, because there are no completely disconnected branches, right? In order for the entire history to be different from how it actually is, like for us to imagine every past moment has got a Grim Reaper ready to kill Fred if and only if none previous one has, right? To imagine that is to imagine a possible world that doesn't overlap with the actual world at any point. But on my theory, the one that I was just advocating on that model, such a world is not metaphysically possible, right? So it's, that's why there can't be infinitely many Grim Reapers. Either there actually is infinitely many Grim Reapers, or it's not possible. But you can't just start with the actual world as it is today and then imagine filling it up with Grim Reapers like with a recombination principle.
Yeah. But it's interesting, though, isn't it, that if that's right, then we have some a priori knowledge about the past. That's still kind of remarkable.
Well, it's kind of like a conditional, but yeah, I think that's right.
So, Alex, I'm wondering if you think that causation is necessary and sufficient for an effect, or if it's just necessary. Because if it's the former, I'm not sure what I see also is producing the effect. But if it is necessary and sufficient, I'm not sure why we get a branching future as opposed to a linear future.
Absolutely. Okay, so on the branching view, you can't have it that causation necessitates its effect, otherwise there'd just be one branch, right? Although that means it's like a limit case of a branching model, I suppose it's just one branch. But if it's if it's any other version of that, what we're talking about is indeterministic causation. So there's like, I'm flipping a coin, it really could go one way or the other. So that's baked in that causes don't necessitate their effects on this model. That's why I was saying I'm just meeting Rob on that ground and just saying let's play around with these ideas. Give me a bunch of definitions. Let's just see what happens.
But that's not necessarily your idea. So you're at least open to causation being necessary and sufficient in each and every case.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't know. I don't have a particularly strong position about whether the actual world really is indeterministic or deterministic. I don't know. I'm not. You should ask a physicist.
Alex, thank you. Nice meeting you, by the way.
Yeah, nice meeting you too. It was a fun event.
All right. Well, thank you.
Cool. See you later.